Hello and welcome to the Gaming with Science podcast, where we talk about the science behind some of your favorite games.
Today, we're going to discuss Undergrove by AEG. Hey, how's it going? Welcome back to Gaming with Science. I'm Brian.
This is Jason.
And I'm Annie.
Annie, how's it going? We've been talking about trying to get you on literally forever, and we finally found a good game to do it. Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name's Anny Chung. I'm an associate professor in plant biology and plant pathology at the University of Georgia. I would classify myself as an ecologist, and what I usually am interested in is the ecology of plants and microbes that interact with plants, usually below ground, which is very appropriate for this game.
Annie's a fancy professor. She has an endowment. She's the Haynes, the Haynes Professor for Underground Ecology or Below Ground Ecology?
It's very specific. I stumbled into it, but I think the full title is the Haynes Endowed Professor for Below Ground Botany. So specifically only below ground. Yeah, I don't get to do anything above ground.
You have a counterpart who does the above ground stuff.
I do have a counterpart, Megan DeMarsh, who is the above ground botany professor.
Anyway, well, your research is really cool, and I'm really glad to have you on. I know that you've said that you are not a card-carrying mycologist, but I also know that you study fungi a lot more than most people that I know. For someone who is not a card-carrying mycologist, I know it's a big part of your work.
Yeah, and that is right. In terms of the microbes that we do study below ground, my lab focuses on fungi quite a lot more than we do bacteria. But yeah, I think the reason I say that I'm not a card-carrying mycologist is that was never a part of my formal training as I was doing my degrees coming into this position. But a lot of our work does involve fungi, and I do like them a lot.
Okay. Well, that's fine. Jason and I like bacteria, but you're still allowed. Anyway, okay, so before we get into talking about Undergrove, and I am very excited to talk about it because this might be a spicy conversation. I did a little bit more research on this, and there's some controversy here. Controversy can lead to fun conversations about sort of science and metaphor and how we communicate science. I think that's definitely part of this. But let's talk about some other science for a bit. So, Annie, we usually send this to the guest first. Do you have an interesting science fact you'd like to share with our dear listeners?
Yeah, since you did tell me that you were going to ask me this question, and I actually did recently find out something super cool. And so a colleague of mine at Rice University recently published a short little correspondence in Current Biology where he and his students found an instance of a plant in some way eating an insect. And so this is a parasitic plant that usually parasitizes oaks, I believe. And this same oak is also parasitized by gall-forming wasps. And so what they found is that this parasitic plant also actively parasitizes the galls that have the wasps in them and kills the wasp, which is really cool. It's like a reversal of what you would imagine, normally think of as trophic levels.
So this is not a carnivorous plant per se, but this is a plant eating a plant that is being parasitized by an insect.
Yeah, and while doing so, also killing the insect. It's pretty cool.
Is it getting nutrients out of that? Like, does it kill the insect? Does it seek out the galls? So because the insect has like extra nitrogen or something in it?
So I don't think they actually have evidence of that yet. I'm sure he's working on it. This is, I think, just to get the phenomenon out. In the paper, they do say that generally where this parasitic plant attaches is not where galls frequently form on these trees. And so they're using that as evidence to say that, hey, these parasitic plants are maybe actively seeking out galls when they do happen, because that's not a normal attachment place for them.
What is the parasitic plant? Is it one that we would have heard of before?
It's called a love vine.
A love vine. What a nice term for a parasite.
The genus name is Cassythia, or Cassytha, actually.
Okay, well, we will definitely drop this into the show notes for sure, so that people can check it out.
Fun little paper.
All right, Jason, did you want something you wanted to share too?
I did. So I was looking up some things that might be relevant to this and found that just a few months ago, there was a group in Europe that published on Mycorrhizae, which are the fungi that we're going to be talking about a lot. and they were trying to study how they grow their underground networks efficiently. Because we'll talk more about this later, but basically these type of fungi, they send all these thin little networks of hyphae, their cells, out
Mm,
through the soil to get nutrients and stuff. But that takes a lot of energy. And so how do they do it well? And so what they did, they had this really cool setup where they had these mycorrhizae growing in petri dishes, lots of them. And like half the petri dish was just the fungus, half also had some roots that they could colonize. And they had a robotic camera set up to take pictures of this automatically. And so they could scan this and automatically detect all the junctions and the way they formed and the way nutrients were flowing inside the hyphae. And they got like 500,000 junction points they were able to catalog and study and be able to figure out essentially the rules of building a mycorrhizal network underground so that it functions well.
okay.
Which is impressive for something that, I mean, it has no nervous system. It's just a fungus growing through the soil looking for nutrients.
I've seen really cool like time lapses, like Zay Frank did a thing on slime molds. Slime molds are not fungi, by the way, but of them basically like solving and recreating like a map of the Japanese subway system. And ants
Yep.
can do stuff like this too. But I've never heard of anyone doing this in 3 dimensions.
Well, this was on a petri dish, so still probably only 2-dimensional.
Okay.
So, but 3 dimensions would be very cool.
Mm,
Yeah,
okay.
no, I read that paper when it came out too. It made quite a splash. It's very exciting. And I think one of the main labs that developed the study or like was driving the study, I think they have these really cool systems where you can actually grow this specific type of mycorrhizal fungi, which usually cannot grow without a host on a petri dish, which in and of itself is like a pretty difficult thing to do. And the fact that they were able to do all of this at such scale and then collaborate with another lab to develop this like robotic imaging technology and like the algorithms to go through all of that imaging data is really cool.
Okay, so there's a bunch of different innovations. First of all, just growing the organism at all is kind of a big deal.
Yeah, I mean, we've known how to do that, but it's hard.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. That's very cool. Well, thank you. Should we talk about Undergrove? What do you think?
Now let's pick a different game. I think that would be a
Oh,
good one.
okay. All right. Let's talk about, I just got the Fox experiment. Do you want to talk about that instead? So Undergrove is a game that came out recently. It is published by a duo of Elizabeth Hargrave and Mark Wootten. So Elizabeth Hargrave, we've talked about before, the lead designer of Wingspan, which we can never get through an episode without talking about Wingspan in terms of how it's revolutionized sort of the science board game space in a meaningful way.
It wasn't even our fault last time. We didn't say it at all. Steven brought it up and still mentioned Wingspan.
I know we're never going to get away from Wingspan, and I don't have a problem with that. But Undergrove is a game that I have been hyped for a year. It's the first game that was coming out. It's like I have to get this. I was excited to see it on Kickstarter. Elizabeth Hargrave of Wingspan fame, and Mark Wootten. This is the second game they've done. They did another game for AG called Mariposis, which is about the monarch butterfly migration. It is for 1 to 4 players, which all of these games have single player mode now. For 10 and up, which now we know means that they had to test to make sure that the pieces are not toxic for children to eat. 60 to 90 minutes, which how long did it take when we played? Because we actually had the convenience of being able to play together, which is always nice.
I don't think that it took 90 minutes.
No, maybe that's for slow players.
I think the 60 to 90 minutes was about right. And especially if you have 4 players, it's going to take longer.
Yeah,
Mhm.
that's true.
For sure. So what does this game look like? So the game has a series of 48 mushroom tiles, very specifically mushroom tiles, with just the above ground portions of the fungi. They seem to have been arbitrarily divided up into 4 different color groups. They're beautifully illustrated. They have, little abilities on them, which we'll get into in a second.
They did actually divide it in a rational way. I found the designer diary. So it's based off of whether they have like pores, which is the one with all the little dots.
Okay.
Whether they have a ring around their stalk, which is the one that's the cap, a cap without rings, I think. And then everything else.
Okay. So it is based on like morphology and identifiable features.
I'm glad to see that they did that because again, with Wingspan, there was that deep connection between abilities and actual biology. So they did split them up in some way that made sense.
Yes.
Okay. So the goal of the game is to lay these mushroom tiles out into a grid. You're kind of building your forest. And at each place where 4 tiles connect, there's a little round hole where you can put your little baby tree seedling. Because in this game, you are playing as a mature Douglas fir tree. tree. Each of the mushrooms will have different abilities on them, and as long as you have a little tiny root touching the fungi, you'll have the ability to use those abilities. And the fungi will let you collect nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. As a plant yourself, you generate carbon through photosynthesis. And a lot of the game is about sort of paying the fungi carbon to activate their abilities. So you give them carbon, and they will allow you to collect the other resources. The other conceit of the game is that those little seedlings are then able to, you're really only lending the fungi the carbon. Like you will put the carbon out onto the fungi, and then the seedlings will say, okay, I will take that back again. And they suck the carbon back up onto the seedlings. And when they've accumulated enough, they sprout into a tree. You'll score points based on the points values of your different mushrooms and the ones that are touching roots, with roots on the different mushrooms. Tracking in the game is done by how often do you absorb carbon. Every time you absorb carbon, you move up this little track. There's little benefits. When you get to the end of the track, you'll trigger the end game. And like a lot of these games, there's also sort of a public goals card based on weird things like, how many trees do you have in a row? Or how many different types of fungi are you interacting with? Or things like that. And like Earth, and like a lot of games where plants are the focus, of course, they put animals only on those public goal cards, because animals are not really important to the bulk of what we're going to be talking about today.
So it's a splash image. It has
It's
nothing
a
to do with
splash
mechanics?
image. It has nothing to do with mechanics. It's just the one thing where they actually bother putting animals into the game is as something that's tangential to the main focus of the game, which I don't have any problem with that. Right?
We talk about how people are blind to the plants and the fungi in the world. Like it's okay to flip that around every now and then. It's like the animals can be the sideshow for a little bit.
It's a beautiful game. The components are lovely. The little cardboard tokens are wonderful. The illustrations are lovely as well.
Well, one aspect of the game is that it's a resource management game / engine builder game. So you're trying to accumulate resources, you're trying to drive them in certain directions, you're trying to build your trees. All of this requires resources, which are pretty scarce, I would say, based on how we played. Like we were always like, I always need more of something. Like there's never a point I was just like rolling in resources and was fine with that. And then the engine building is kind of odd. It's like it builds itself as an engine builder. And I felt that was weird because I never really felt I got an engine going. But looking over the designer diary, apparently the idea is that your engine, it's a slow engine. It rolls over several turns. So like this turn I do this, next turn I do this, next turn I do this. That's my engine.
Okay.
Whereas I'm more used to things where it's like, okay, I assemble a bunch of things and this turn I just fire off and that's my engine. So it's more of a slow roll engine.
Okay, that kind of makes sense. And I can kind of see that, how it's like you have to run through multiple turns to run through all the different actions. Talking about the resource being limited, I always feel like there's 5 different things that you can do in the game in terms of actions. You can sprout a seedling. You can grow roots onto different mushrooms. Both of those, if you pay extra, you can place a new mushroom tile to do something. Let's see. Those 2 of them. You can activate abilities on the mushrooms that are out there to get them to pull in stuff for you. You can absorb carbon. And then the last action, which always feels terrible, is photosynthesis, which as a plant seems weird because you always feel like, well, I don't really want to photosynthesize. That's so boring.
Yeah, it feels like you're wasting an action by photosynthesizing, which was something I had observed as well, because like that should just be happening by default, right? Like we're playing.
Yeah, I mean, you should just be generating a little bit of carbon all the time, right?
Yeah.
Instead of having to make a point of doing it.
Apparently it was like that in one of the early versions of the game, and then they changed it, and I don't remember why or if they even mentioned why. So you mentioned what the resources are. So we've mentioned carbon.
Carbon are little black circles, which sort of distinguishes them from the 3 different cubes. Now, we've talked about soil fertility, at least in terms of agriculture, as being based on potassium, phosphorus, and nitrogen, right? So you've got 3 different colored cubes that indicate those 3 different resources. And a lot of times cubes can be spent to, like every time you want to place a mushroom, you just have to pay an extra cube. You've got to put some of your resources out to say like, hey, fungi, come out and play. Nitrogen is sort of the weird. How do they do this? It's like they explain this in the book. I think they said that phosphorus is important for seeds and you need potassium to like pay for moving nutrients around. Nitrogen you use for like literally everything, which kind of is reflected in the game because nitrogen is like the most generic currency. You can use it to pay for just about anything.
What can I say? One thing about the design of the game that I really kind of enjoyed
Please.
is actually the color of the resources. Because, well, at least for carbon and nitrogen, they reflect the most common colors that people use when in ecosystem science, when people talk about carbon cycling,
Mhm.
nitrogen cycling, a lot of times they are always black and blue, and it's just kind of been the convention. So it kind of tickled me that those were the colors in the game as well.
I'm not sure whether they used purple and orange for the other two, though. That's a little odd because I don't think that's part of convention, but I actually never checked.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
beautiful, but yeah, those two I feel like aren't quite as part of
Mhm.
the convention.
This is one of these games where I feel like when you're just playing on a regular table, you never feel like you have enough space for all the bits and pieces. It doesn't matter how big your table is, you always feel like something is in the way. And they never give a place where you're supposed to put a bowl of chips.
Yeah, well, I will say, especially because you're building a common playing board, especially if you set it up without that in mind, you're not going to leave enough space around the edges as your mushroom board grows out bigger and bigger and bigger in potentially like very random directions, depending on how people want to lay things out and how people want to
Mhm.
isolate themselves from other people.
I think that pretty much covers it for the game. As you move up the carbon track, you'll get little benefits for doing so as you go up things. It's like, hey, have a free nitrogen. Here, get a free root, stuff like that. Just like rewards for moving up that track.
Yeah, I think a key part is that at the end of the game, it's a point scoring game, and
Hmm.
your goal is to get as many points as possible. You get points based on your little seedlings, and you only get points based on the mushrooms they have roots on, and then also how robust your seedling is, like how much carbon it's absorbed. So if you have only one carbon on it, you can only score one of the mushrooms it has a root on, even if it has on all four it's touching. If it has two carbons, you can do two. At three, it turns into a tree and you can do them all. So there's a high incentive to turn something into a tree because then every root that it has manages to score points at the end. And the different mushrooms are worth different points. And some of them are straightforward, like, oh, this is worth 2 points. And some of them are more tricky, like, oh, this is worth 1 point for every similar mushroom that is touching it. Or this one, when you use it, you can cache a resource on it and it's worth 2 points for every cache resource and stuff. So there's a few different ways around there. Plus, there's the bonus goals and some things you can pick up along the way. But it's mostly.
The points are actually indicated by pine cones. So I guess it's a gentle nod to reproductive success.
Well, I think in this game they'd be a fir cone, wouldn't they?
Yes, you're right. Of course, a cone. Sorry, but yeah, basically the you're going to get more points if you have a more robust mycorrhizal network with more trees in it, right?
Hmm.
Okay. So that's the game, and we've talked about this a little bit, but I think we should talk about the science. So there was an old system. It's actually probably, I don't know, people probably still learn this, the whole five kingdom systems for
Yeah,
life.
yeah.
So everything that's microscopic gets split off into two kingdoms, the Monera and the Protists, and we're not going to talk about those. Everything that you can see fall either into animals, plants, or fungi, right? So and I think we don't use that system anymore because those sort of we know that there's a lot more diversity in the microscopic. And actually, everything you can see is this tiny little iceberg tip sitting at the peak of like everything that has a nucleus, all the eukaryotic cells. But what distinguishes fungi from plants? What makes a fungi distinct from a plant, from an animal?
Well, so there are a couple of different things, right? So when we think about plant cells and animal cells, a big thing we talk about is the fact that their cell structures are very different, and that is the same for fungal cells as well, right? Fungi have very different cell wall structure
Hmm.
compared to plant cells. That's one thing a lot of folks bring up. And also they just grow very differently. They have very different reproductive life cycles, and they form hyphae instead of the kinds of root-like structures that we think of plants as forming.
Hmm.
What else?
So hyphae is just like a one's. It's like a hyphae is just like a single cell filament, right? One cell thick and just a long, thin strand.
Yeah, and they can be, septate or aseptate, so
Hmm.
maybe whether there's actually any divisions between the cells, right? So, a fun fact for arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, a lot of them just have nuclei floating around all over the place.
Just one big cell with lots of nuclei in it.
Kinda, yeah, right. So there's no like nice division separating one nucleus per cell sort of situation. You just got nuclei flowing
Hmm.
all over the place.
So let's see if we had to drill down to the bare basics basics, like animal cells, no cell walls. Plant cells have cell walls. They have got cellulose in them, and most of them can do photosynthesis, so they're going to use sun energy to go under. This is the problem with biology, right? There are exceptions.
Yeah.
Fungi have rigid cell walls, and they have chitin in them. They actually the same kind of polymer you'd have in an insect or an arthropod exoskeleton. They use in their cell walls, and they do not do photosynthesis.
They do not.
Okay.
And they're all heterotrophic.
Meaning they in the same way that animals have to eat plants, fungi have to also eat plants and other things. They don't make their own energy. They have to break it down.
Yep.
Okay.
Some fungi form relationships with plants in this like very physically entwined way, and these are fungi we call mycorrhizae. And there's actually a whole lot of different types of mycorrhizae. The ones that are kind of modeled in the game are a type called ectomycorrhizae, and so these are the types of fungi that form mycorrhizas with generally trees, often gymnosperm trees, but also some other trees as well.
So gymnosperms are kind of like your pines, your firs, the things that form cones, as opposed to things that form flowers.
The things that form cones. Yep, that's right.
So, and let's also break down the term ectomycorrhizae. So ecto would mean outside. What's the best thing for ecto that we would have? Unfortunately, I think everybody thinks ectoplasm, but I don't know if there's a better thing that we could use that sort of helps people remember ecto meaning outside. Any ideas? The only other thing I'm thinking is ectotherm, and that doesn't really help very much. Ectotherm would be for cold-blooded animals, but heated from the outside.
Yeah, well, they rely on outside forces to regulate their temperature. So that's the kind of way to think about it, I suppose.
But and they're called ecto because there's, again, like Andy said, there's several different types of mycorrhizae. Some of them will actually send structures literally inside the plant cell itself. They will form structures across the plasma membrane inside. But ectos don't do that. Their relationship sort of ends at the plant cell wall. They actually don't send things inside the cells.
Well, so that's not actually fully correct.
No? Okay, tell me.
So that is the really kind of confusing part about the name ectomycorrhizae, because they do actually penetrate inside the plant root, right? They don't just stay outside the plant root.
But do they get past the plasma membrane? Do they actually send things inside the cells?
They don't usually send things inside the cell, so they go kind of in between the cells to form this structure called a Hartig net.
Yeah.
But it is confusing I think the name is confusing because a lot of people think about the term ecto and then assume that they don't penetrate inside the roots at all.
So they do have this very intimate relationship where the little hyphae, the little mycelial threads, get completely inside the root, all in the cell wall, different tissue layers, but they never actually get inside the plant cells themselves.
Well, let's put it this way. That's probably how it usually works. Biology is messy. If you look hard enough, you will find an exception. But that seems to be the general rule.
The general rule is that there's usually something that breaks the rule in biology, if you look hard enough.
That's true. I'm like, yeah, I feel like that's generally the case. And now that you've got me like making specific certain...
Well, let's just contrast this with the other major one, which is the arbuscular mycorrhizae.
And that's true. We can contrast this group with arbuscular mycorrhizae, which is one other major group of mycorrhizae. And these generally form relationships all across the plant tree of life. They form relationships with trees, with grasses, with forbs. One interesting plant that they don't usually form relationships with is Arabidopsis.
Much to the sadness of plant biologists everywhere, since Arabidopsis is the model system that most work has been done with on plants, and this very important relationship
happens to not work with Arabidopsis. Yeah. Anyway, but as Jason was alluding to, so these arbuscular mycorrhizae, they form structures inside the plant cells for resource storage and for resource exchange. And so the arbuscular part of the arbuscular mycorrhizae refers to the structures that they form inside plant cells called arbuscules. And so that comes from the Latin root for tree-like. So it's like kind of a tree-shaped structure that they form inside the plant cell, and that's where a lot of the resource exchange happens. They also form vesicles, which are these like kind of big, what's thought of as resource storage bubbles inside plant cells as well. And then there are two kind of other major groups of mycorrhizae that we think about. One is ericoid mycorrhizae. They generally form relationships with plants in the ericaceae, so like blueberries, rhododendrons, and so on. And then the last group is orchid mycorrhizae, which are extremely important, and orchids are actually obligate in symbiosis with orchid mycorrhizae because their seeds are so tiny and have so few resources that they literally cannot germinate without symbiosis with an orchid mycorrhiza.
So obligate means they have to do it all the time. And that would contrast with facultative, where they can do it, they don't have to do it. Sometimes they can, they don't really need to. Orchid mycorrhizae are crazy because, like you said, orchid seeds are dust. They don't have endosperm. They have no food inside the seed. So if they don't have they steal their nutrients from the mycorrhizae, right?
Exactly. In that very early stage of life, they're essentially, the orchids are essentially a parasite.
Mm-hmm.
So here's my question. A lot of orchids I know, they grow like in the treetops. So are there mycorrhizae spores just like drifting around in the rainforest canopy?
There are mycorrhizae spores just drifting around anywhere, really. Even things that we think of that are, arbuscular mycorrhizal fungal spores, ectomycorrhizal fungal spores, they're just drifting all over the place. There's actually evidence for in tropical rainforests where you can get these kind of soil mats built up on big tree branches on top of tall trees, right? Just debris falling down on these branches, they decompose, they kind of form these like kind of spongy layers, and then you get epiphytes and other plants starting to grow on top of these like little bits of soil on a tree. People have found mycorrhizae in those circumstances.
Okay. So we talked about you've got ericoid, orchid, and arbuscular mycorrhizae. Those are all kind of specialists for that, or do they have to be mycorrhizae, or can they live in other ways?
Arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi are like kind of the special group here. They are not known to be very culturable unless they are in symbiosis with a plant. So these are things that are on the fungal side, obligate with a plant host.
Gotcha.
Whereas for all the other mycorrhizal fungi and groups, you can actually grow them in culture without a plant. They will just do that.
So we can grow them in a petri plate. Like we know how to do
Grow
that.
them on a petri plate. They sometimes will grow very slowly, especially things like ericoid mycorrhizae tend to grow pretty slowly if you have them in culture, but they will grow. They don't need a plant in order to survive.
So what's neat about the ectomycorrhizae is that a lot of those are kind of like, they're very optional. Like a lot of the things that we think of as mushrooms, a lot of like very charismatic species that we would think of for fungi also form these kind of relationships, these ectomycorrhizal relationships, right?
Yep.
And what is not controversial is that there definitely is resource exchange happening. That is happening, right?
That is not controversial, yeah.
Okay.
And so they do form these mycorrhizae. So the mycorrhizae is like that combination of the fungus and the root, right?
Okay.
And it is not controversial that there is resource exchange happening. Exchange meaning that there is resource going from one partner to the other partner, right? Whether that is driven by just concentration gradients or source sink relationships with just surplus carbon flowing places. That's where kind of the nitty gritty and what exactly is happening, how do we characterize it, so-called controversy can happen.
Yeah, but it's the basic idea that there's a trade going on one way or another. The plant has lots of fixed carbon, so food, essentially sugars or fats that it will trade to the fungus because that's what plants are really good at is they turn sunlight into food. And so they're giving that to the fungus. And then the fungus, because of all these little hyphae that go through the soil everywhere, is really good at getting water and nutrients from the soil, like the nitrogen, the phosphorus, the potassium that we talked about in the game. And so this sorts of resource goes from the fungus to the plant. And in theory, it's a great symbiosis. I know there are times where sometimes one or the other essentially is parasitizing its partner. But in theory, it's a good symbiosis where both are benefiting.
Right, exactly. And like not just on the fungal side, not just because they're able to explore a much larger area given their little hyphae going everywhere. But also they're able to produce enzymes and partner with other microorganisms that produce enzymes that plants cannot, right? So they're able to break down leaf litter, other organic forms of compounds out there into forms that are easily accessible by the plant.
You know, in a weird way, it kind of reminds me of the human gut microbiome that we just discussed. You've got microbes in your gut that help you break down resources so that you can digest. Now, plants don't have guts, but they do have roots, and they form associations with microbes that effectively are doing a similar thing, helping them access and break down nutrients that they wouldn't have access to otherwise. The symbiosis can be a lot tighter for mycorrhizae and roots, of course, but there's also that same sort of complexity. It's like, yes, it can be symbiotic, but as Jason likes to point out, the harmony in nature is an illusion based on everything pulling as hard as they can, right, in the same direction, and it all just kind of balances out.
Exactly. Yeah. I think the way, one of a lot of people that I talk to in the field think about it is it's a mutual exploitation, right?
Yep. Okay, so there's nothing controversial about plants paying carbon or providing carbon, and that the fungi providing rare soil resources like nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. Now, what is a little controversial here is this idea that the mature trees can focus and move carbon to their seedlings, specifically ones of their own species or genetic makeup. That is the mother tree concept, and that is something that sort of, at least there's a lot of people who think that the evidence for it is pretty scant.
Yeah, I think that, I think that whole part of it has a combination of different things, right? I think there's no disputing the fact that there have been experiments done where folks have shown using labeled carbon, where carbon from a mature tree or one tree seedling can go via the fungal connection to another tree.
Mm-hmm.
There are some studies showing that there is discrimination based on different species and how related they are. I think kind of where some of the controversy happens, or what we don't really know yet for sure, is how frequently this actually happens in nature, in the field, right? Most of these studies have been done in the greenhouse where you can actually do a lot of these more complicated manipulations to really, really drill down on the mechanisms. But as you can imagine, it can be really, really difficult to actually measure any of this in the field when you're dealing with an actual mature Doug fir tree, right? And so the evidence that we can get from the field can sometimes be more circumstantial, right? We can't drill down in every single mechanism that needs to happen in order to fully support this. And also, I think just to kind of address the term, the mother tree, right, hypothesis, I feel like that whole concept is something that has been borne out in the public imagination, right? It's not necessarily a term that the original authors came up with as a scientific hypothesis, but because of a combination of the public imagination and future work that has been done in the area, it kind of became something that people refer to as a hypothesis, which adds to the confusion in the literature, as you might imagine.
So it comes from a popular science book written by the ecologist Suzanne Simard. And a lot of this work and this idea comes from her specific research project. So there was an incredibly popular public science book on, again, it also invents this term of the World Wood Web. Am I saying that right?
The Wood Wide Web.
The Wood Wide Web, which is this idea of the network of fungi and exchanging information and resources and sharing them. The point of the book and this idea of like mature trees nurturing their offspring was really purposely introduced as this idea of like helping people sort of connect to trees and anthropomorphize them. Yeah. But the problem is that maybe it went a little farther than the evidence would fully support, or it's not clear, or there was a lovely point-by-point, a counterpoint to some of these claims and these experiments about the dangers of anthropomorphizing trees, and particularly the mother tree concept, how it doesn't match up with ecology, how we actually see that mature trees tend to heavily compete with seedlings in the soil. and that actually they don't really benefit from having a mature tree available. They do much better if there's no mature tree around because you're not seeing as much of this competition for rare resources. But this very careful point by point was published in Trends in Plant Biology and it sits behind a paywall. It took me forever to actually find any place where we would be able to share this with our listeners. So the people that are trying to counter this as sort of pseudoscientific or not well supported are not getting their message out in any way that the public in general would be able to access.
Yeah, and just to kind of make sure that a lot of this is also represented on both sides, I will say that there is now a counter point-by-point paper that was just published at the end of last year from Simard's group, kind of countering the point-by-point that you had. Probably read the paper published by Justine Karst. And so there is this very active back and forth that is happening right now.
And I think it's important to point out, like, this is how science gets done. It's like one experiment never completely seals off anything. You need to replicate it. Sometimes if things are ambiguous, people argue, people have their own opinions, and it's by the community engaging with each other and doing the experiments and looking at the work that it gets settled. And I mean, it probably won't get settled until you get hard data, because ideally, it's like the one arbiter of all of this is the data. Now, there's the caveat that there are sometimes different ways to interpret that data. But at the end of the day, it's like if there's a conflict between your hypothesis and the results you got, the results win. And so at least that's how science is supposed to work. And so this back and forth, this arguing is the process of how we discover truth. I like to say that in science, truth is not what emerges like shining and brilliant. Truth is what survives everything you can throw at it. And that's how we slowly get a better idea of how the world works.
But what if you're publishing your science in a popular science book that captures the public imagination? There's no peer review and automated correction process for things like that.
That's where science communication has to work. And again, that process is part of it, of trying to get that out through good science communication. I mean, I have faced this. I have had to essentially contradict people who bring up these like 50 or 60-year-old books talking about how plants can sense people's emotions. And it's like, that did not hold up to replicated study. That was probably an error. And so some of those, yes, they still float around because the popular science books have a much wider reach than the specialized scientific literature. That's why the communication of science is so important. And let's be honest, that's part of the reason why we do this podcast, is because we want to communicate stuff like that out.
In an interview with Elizabeth Hargrave and Mark Wootten, they kind of tangentially say that maybe it's not all figured out. They kind of don't handle it face on. They kind of like move to the side.
Right. But I think the main part of the mechanism of the game that's really reflective of this kind of mother tree idea, right, is when in the game you photosynthesize as a mature Doug fir, and then you move that carbon into one of the mushroom tiles, one of the fungi tiles, right? And then in order to produce a seedling in and around those mushroom tiles, you have to then move that carbon and pay some sort of carbon cost from the mushroom specifically in order to make that seeding, right? So I think that is the part of the mechanism that I found really interesting that they chose to do that, because that kind of very specifically introduces the idea that that is the way the carbon flow should be happening. And I might argue that even if, right, let's say that because we have some evidence that there is some carbon flow going, I think most folks would agree that that is not the vast majority of the way the carbon flows through the system. That's not the vast majority of where a seedling that is germinating is getting their carbon from.
Yep. And they actually mentioned that in the rule book, that the amount of carbon that a seedling could take up through these networks is very, very small relative to the amount it can photosynthesize. And then put in the caveat, but maybe when you're a newly emerging seedling, that little bit can be important. I'll be honest. I'm not sure. I'll be honest. I'm not sure I get the metaphor of like, I know I'm supposed to be like the mother tree, like doing all this work, but all the work is around the seedlings. I can only activate the mushrooms that my seedlings have roots on. It's like, I can only move the nutrients around to use it for the seedlings. There's no actual mother tree anywhere in the game except in like the abstract part of here's my player board, but it occupies no space. I almost feel like the game works like, oh, you're just a bunch of little seedlings trying to make a go at it, and this is how it works.
Carbon should just get fed into the network naturally, right?
Something like that technically is kind of what happens. There is that
Yeah.
one. So with the starting tile, there's a central mushroom and then four on the outside. And the central one has the ability that if there's no carbon anywhere in the network, it will put carbon out there. And so it kind of has that.
Yeah, but it's just weird that that's coming from a mushroom, right? Like, I think the part that the game doesn't make very explicit is that all of this carbon flowing through a system is coming via photosynthesis, either from the seedling or from mature trees, or any other plants in the ecosystem, if you want to think about this more realistically.
Yeah, but it actually does make a little bit of sense of why that one's doing it, because it turns out that central tile on the starting tile is like the mycorrhizae that is in like every paper ever published in terms of what is forming associations with the Douglas firs. It's apparently super, super common. And it doesn't have a common name because it doesn't actually form a mushroom. So it only has a Latin name. So Elizabeth Hargrave had to make up a name. She called it Earth Lover because that's basically the anglicization of its Latin name, Geophilus, I think.
Mm.
I didn't get that at all.
And so it's essentially the one that's networking with the entire forest, most likely. And that's probably where that carbon's coming from.
Okay, so Undergrove does a reasonable job of modeling this particular hypothesis. This particular of like the sharing of carbon being used by seedlings, of the exchange of nutrients representing mycorrhizae, in particular ectomycorrhizae, which again, much more sort of dynamic because a lot of them form mushrooms that people would recognize.
Much more photogenic.
Photogenic, that's
They
the best way to
are.
put it. Because you can actually like we talk about all of the macroscopic life, and it's really like fungi. I guess mycelia can be visible, but usually the only part we ever see is the above ground part that comes up sometimes when it rains a bunch.
Right, and that's like such a small fraction of total fungal diversity that exists in the world, right? All the things that I study in my lab, none of them form mushrooms, so we just keep them on plates and they look pretty drab. Sometimes they look really cool, but
I feel like we don't need a distinct nitpick corner with this or maybe we do. I feel like we've already had some nitpicks at this point about things that maybe we don't think are quite as they should be. It's been about photosynthesis being misrepresented.
I just have one is that I wish the roots, the little root triangle tokens you put on the board were higher contrast or something because as the game progresses, you end up with more and more of these roots around and they determine what you can do, which means your turn gets more and more complicated as you can only do one thing, but instead of having 5 things to choose from, you actually have like 12. And finding my roots on the board can actually be kind of tricky. It's like, where do I have roots? Which mushrooms can I activate? It's like, okay, I've got that one, and just like having a little bit higher contrast, maybe like a white outline around them or something would have been nice.
Color choices in these games are always hard because it just ends up as a blah rainbow. And like for the trees, they used very tree-like colors. It was like green and brown and beige and gray, I think. I don't know. Very neutral tones. Annie, did you have a nitpick?
well, I don't know. I think we talked a lot about my science nitpicks. I think I was just very confused by the carbon economy in this game because it just did not reflect my understanding of how the carbon economy generally works in these systems. So I guess that's not really a nitpick, that's just a pick. The part where you had to activate a mushroom was also a little bit funny to me. But it was interesting to me that there was a component of competition that emerged in this game that I wasn't expecting. I think as we were playing at one point where we all had little tree seedlings that were tapped into, quote unquote, the same mushroom. And I remember at one point when playing the game, we all kind of were trying to get carbon from that one mushroom, but we didn't want to let anyone else have the carbon. I was trying to think really hard, like, is there like a actual analog to this that would actually happen out in a pine fir ecosystem? And I'm still trying to think whether that would actually happen if there is competition via mycorrhizal provided resources, if that's something that we know for sure can actually happen.
Interesting. I would be surprised if you've got multiple individuals tapped into the same sort of individual hyphal body, would it not be reasonable to think that there would be competition?
Yeah, I think it's a very reasonable assumption that something could happen. I'm just trying to think if there's a good way to test that. I've actually seen more tests of the opposite, where you have multiple mycorrhizal taxa, so different mycorrhizal fungal species that are connected with the same plant. And so there are many studies in which folks have done what are called split root studies, where you kind of split the same plant and its various root structures into different pots. And then in each pot, you inoculate kind of different fungi. And then in some cases, people have shown that there is preferential carbon allocation to the fungal partners that are providing more nutrient benefits.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so it's kind of from the plant side, fungi competing for the plant's resources.
Okay, that's interesting. But then I imagine there's also that counter argument of like maybe they're just being a better sink for those nutrients.
Exactly, right. That is the count. And that's why this whole field is so hard to get like 100% ironclad. This is exactly what's going on, right? Because you can measure the flow of certain elements from one part to another part. You can measure how much of it there is, but there's always this question about, hey, is it just a source sink dynamic? Is it just that plants have lots of surplus carbon that they need to get rid of and they happen to do it in this way? And that causes the exchange, or whether there is like this sort of active, what's called biological markets theory, where people apply the concept to kind of the economic exchange rate to the rate of exchange of carbon versus other elements. And so those are kind of two very big theories that are somewhat in competition with each other when it comes to how this exchange sort of actually works in the real world.
I am terrified to do the science grade for this one because I don't know how to judge it anymore. So actually,
it is hard.
It is difficult. I actually would love to hear each of so let's move on to grading. We're going to do a grade for science and a grade for fun. We each kind of have our own scale. We definitely do grade inflation on gaming with science. We usually assume a B and then go from there. And I'd love to hear about the science grade and your rationale. You're going to help me make my own decision here because I kind of went into it with some like, I don't know about this one, but I'd love to hear the arguments. So who would like to go first, Jason or Annie? Who's up? Who wants to be first up?
I want Jason to go first.
Okay. So I'm just kind of making my gut feeling here based off of the science it's trying to portray and all of the science it's trying to portray, because we focus a lot on the mother tree, but there's also a bunch of the mycorrhizal symbiosis and the nutrient exchange stuff. I would probably give it a B+. And I would do that because a lot of the science it shows is correct. It's like plants make associations with mycorrhizae. There's nutrient exchange that way. It's especially important for getting these the nitrogen and the phosphorus and stuff. It's like that part, like that interconnection between the plants and the fungi, and kind of getting to the point that this fungi form this whole invisible ecosystem and network underneath the forest floor, I think is correct. The whole mother tree thing, okay, yeah, that dings its grade a little bit because I don't know, maybe the controversy or the counterpoints of that weren't fully developed when they first started the game. You can imagine if you get halfway through developing a game and suddenly the science changes, like, well, now what do we do?
It's the danger of science is it tends to be sort of shifts as we learn more, right?
Yeah. So yeah, okay, that part. But I'll be honest, based on my playing of the game, that part of the metaphor is actually pretty dispensable. It's like I forgot that was actually part of the metaphor for most of my play of the game.
That's unfortunate. That's the whole thing.
I don't think it's necessary. I'm playing with seedlings and fungi, and it works just fine. And a little bit of abstraction about a shared pool of resources, but I never really remembered, like, oh, right, I'm playing a tree that is trying to help its own little seedlings out. I was like, whatever. So it's like, I'd say B+ for those reasons. It's like most of what it shows is good. Some stuff, maybe not so much.
Okay. All right, Annie, what do you think? You can abstain. You can abstain. You don't have to give a grade.
Okay. Well, I think it's fun to give a grade.
Okay.
I'll give it a B-. I think I'm a little more disturbed than Jason about the carbon economy that's being represented in this game. I just can't get over it. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But I just like remember thinking through the carbon economy of the game, and I'm just like, this is very confusing to me. And I think I appreciate, Jason, that you brought up the fact that it is in the booklet or somewhere, where the game developers clarify that, like, the amount of carbon that any seedling is getting from its fungal symbiotic partner is like a tiny, tiny fraction of all the carbon that it needs to actually grow and become a tree, which that is very important. And I think that is a really important thing. And I would hate for someone playing the game to like get the sort of misguided idea that when tree seedlings grow up, like they're literally relying on the fungal partner to provide all the carbon they need to get into being a tree. So I feel like that's what brings my grade down to a B minus. I agree with you, Jason, in that like the whole mother tree metaphor isn't super. You can play it without really thinking about it. And honestly, I wasn't really thinking about it until like after being done with the game. I was like, oh, why did we do that? Oh, I bet it's because of this thing. But yeah, I think the things that it does well is introducing the fact that plants interact with fungi and often in a mutualistic way, and that mutualism involves resource flowing from the plant to the fungus and then the fungus to the plant, and they capitalize on different resources and mutually exploit each other for different resources. So I think that part was well developed in the game.
Maybe if they had done orchids instead of Douglas firs, because we know orchids actually do need to exploit
That's
very
true.
specifically.
That's true.
So I think I'm going to stick with my original opinion, and I think I'm going to give an Elizabeth Hargrave game a C.
Ooh, that's harsh.
It is harsh,
I was
but
trying to be a little less harsh.
yeah, and I think, if she wants to apply for a regrade, that's fine. I understand. But the problem is that when I think about a science game, my biggest concern, and the games that have gotten low grades from me, is feeling like I'm worried that people will get their good facts mixed up with their bad facts. And unfortunately, the metaphor here, while it's clarified in a footnote in the game, in the rule book, that there's only a small fraction of the carbon, that is not how the game plays. You cannot grow your seedling into a tree until it's gotten 3 carbon. And the ability for it to get carbon off the fungi is the most important thing in the whole game. That's how you score. That's everything is based on how much carbon are you absorbing. You literally move up the track to win the game based on absorbing carbon from fungi. It's the whole thing. And if that's the weakest part of the whole story, then unfortunately, and I hate this because this is very cool. I love that it's a game about mycorrhizae. I love that the things about getting other rare nutrients, that's fine. But this whole idea of then moving that carbon back onto the seedlings, that's not nearly as solid as it's being portrayed. So I do worry that if somebody just plays this game, it reinforces ideas that may not actually end up holding up to the test of time. So I'm going to stick with my C. I'm very sorry. You can apply for a regrade, okay? We can discuss it in more detail.
Now we talk about having to make compromises between fun and reality.
I know.
And I'm gathering that there were some of those compromises made. When I skimmed the designer diary, they specifically mentioned that earlier versions were much more scientifically accurate, but really not all that fun. So they definitely intentionally made choices to try to make it a game you would like to play first.
Yeah.
And that hopefully reflect the science. So let's get to the gameplay.
Yeah. I still think they could have done the same thing with orchids, and then it's orchids, and everybody loves orchids. Orchids are so cool.
Yes, but orchids don't make mushrooms.
Well, but we were
Orchids
already
make
compromising
orchids.
in one way.
Yes, they do make orchids, but I think this was because Elizabeth Hargrave makes games around things she loves. She's a
mushroomer.
Wingspan because she's a birder, she's a mushroomer, a butterflyer.
But she's not an orchider.
I don't know. Maybe that will be the next one. So
Maybe.
anyway, Brian, your turn to go first. What's the fun?
For fun, I'm just a solid B on this. I liked it. I think you probably, from talking to you, Jason, I think, it would be nice if it was a different sort of engine game, right? Where you kind of get to do a whole bunch of things all at once. The separation in time I didn't love. I love the little mushrooms. I think the components are great. I think it's a pretty game, and it's a game I'd be happy to play. So I will give it a B.
Annie, what about you?
I don't play board games a lot.
Oh, you're not a nerd?
I am a certified nerd.
Hey, there are many, many flavors of nerds. We're not just
very
board game
many
nerds.
flavors.
Don't be
Yeah.
elitist, Brian.
But I
Sorry,
will
sorry.
I mean, I'm just gonna give it an A because I don't play a lot of board games, and this was
Okay.
really fun. I
right.
had a great time. And I love the mushroom art. I'm very excited and happy that like mushrooms are entering the just like regular art zeitgeist, and now there's mushroom themed anything you can get like at Target or anywhere.
That's very true.
And yeah, I just like when I was playing the game, I just found myself picking the mushrooms that looked the prettiest and playing them because why not?
Oh yeah, you were always going after the purple mushrooms.
That's true.
That's
You
right.
were.
I was always going after the purple mushrooms because they looked really cool. And
Oh, that's
it turns out that it's okay that you don't have a whole lot of strategy when you put down mushrooms. So I'm gonna give it an A. It was a fun time.
All right. What about you, Jason?
I'm probably going to give this about a B plus as well, just because like it's fun. I felt a little frustrated because I kept feeling like I wanted to do more. And maybe it's because it was billed as an engine building game, and I never felt I got an engine going. To me, if I build an engine, then turns late in the game should be more powerful than turns early in the game. And I never really felt like I got to that point. There's also just a lot to keep track of. So like the little flipping the tokens over to say, oh, I've used this type of mushroom. I can't do that again until I refresh it somehow. That was, I'm sure it involves some sort of control over like, and strategic choices, but mostly it was something that I tended to forget about. And it's like, oh wait, could I do that? It's like, okay, yes, I can. And I do it like after the fact. So there's a lot of things to keep track of is a little bit. It's kind of like, getting a flow state is like there's just enough to push you, but not so much you feel overwhelmed. And when there's near the end of the game, when there were like 10 different mushrooms I could activate and trying to figure out which one is the most strategically optimal one for me to activate, like that was starting to get a little bit of outside that range. So I wouldn't mind playing this. I would actually like to play this again several more times.
Yeah.
Now that
I'll bring it on Saturday. We'll play it on Saturday.
Okay. Because basically part of that is the learning the game. The more I play a game, the more I'm able to make some of that sort of unconscious and assumed. And so I'm able to focus more on strategy. So I want to play this a few more times to see if I can get to that point.
This is another problem with the Gaming with Science project is we're constantly playing something new. We play something a couple of times and then we have to move on to the next thing, right?
Let's be honest, most of the board games on my shelves have gotten played like half a dozen times or less total in their entire lifespan. A game you go back to 10, 20 times is like a winner. It's solid.
Yeah. But they look beautiful on the shelf, so.
They do.
Right, and Jason, I actually just thought of this like funny example for like the mycorrhizal network thing. 3 years ago now, I was hiking in Patagonia, so in southern Chile, in the Torres del Paine National Park. And one of the people that I ended up kind of walking a lot with was this woman who was from Chile. She mostly spoke Spanish. I speak very little Spanish, and she spoke very little English. And those were very long hikes. And at some point, we were trying to like talk about what we each did. And she was asking me about my research, which I was extremely incapable of explaining in Spanish. So I was trying really hard to like, talk about plants and fungi. And then at a certain point, she suddenly said, oh, like Avatar.
Yes, I was going to bring that up. Like the whole mycelium network was the inspiration for Avatar. There's that one scene with the two scientists.
That one scene where they connect their like little cables into the tree and then they like have a little like
their
dance
USB cords.
moment. Right?
Yeah, but there's an earlier scene with the two scientists. Like one is poking and it's like, look here, and then you see over here, it's like, look, signal transduction, and it's like, there, like those are actual scientists because they're so excited that they've put wires on trees and there's a signal going between them.
Yeah, and so like this is just like a crazy moment for me, like this just like complete stranger I met in Chile while hiking. The moment of connection that she could make to me trying very poorly to explain my research in Spanish was Avatar, right? Like that's the image that came to her mind when she suddenly made that connection.
Interesting.
And I mean, I was kind of just like, yeah, kind of, not exactly, but yes, kind of, right? Like
less bioluminescence.
Yeah.
But I think that's an important point we talked about like the mother tree and stuff. These things, even when they get it kind of wrong, it can form an entry point where you can say, okay, yeah, like that's sort of based off of this. And now we can talk about the reality, which is more complicated and messy and stuff.
Narratives are useful, right? I mean,
Yeah.
we're telling stories in science all the time, and even a bad story can be a good starting point. All right. Well, I think with that, it's been a great conversation. Thank you for talking about a spicy scientific controversy, which what that means for us is that people write passive aggressive papers every couple of months. That's
Yep, that's right. Well, thank you so much for having me on. This was really fun, and I had a great time playing the game with you guys.
So, Jason, do you want to take us out?
Sure. All right. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up there. So thank you, Annie, for coming on the show. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Have a great month and happy gaming.
And have fun playing dice with the universe. See ya. This has been the Gaming with Science podcast, copyright 2025. Listeners are free to reuse this recording for any non-commercial purpose, as long as credit is given to Gaming with Science. This podcast is produced with support from the University of Georgia. All opinions are those of the hosts and do not imply endorsement by the sponsors. If you wish to purchase any of the games that we've talked about, we encourage you to do so through your friendly local game store. Thank you, and have fun playing dice with the universe.